If we want to look at success of school food, it just looks like what you would expect if you went down the street to any food service operation and paid for food. But unfortunately, we've come to accept that in a school food environment, or for that matter, an institutional environment, it should look anything different. Like even the term school food, it's like making an excuse for the food that's served in a school.
It's school food. It's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Well, hello, welcome to the Dr. Drew Ramsey podcast. We are here to get your mental fitness in shape, get your mental health tuned up, have great conversations with the people who are going to help us do that. So it's just a treat to get to spend a little time with you. We have one of my favorite guys on. We got this guy, Dan Giusti, who is a top chef. He grew up in an Italian family, food-loving family. He went to the Culinary Institute of America in New York. If you don't know the culinary world, that is the place to go. And so he is an exceptionally well-trained chef. He rose up through the culinary ranks and then served as the executive chef of 1789 in Washington, D.C. If you follow Dan like I do on Instagram, you get to see him head back to some of his old haunts occasionally. And it's just a really fun way to experience the food world. But eventually he found himself, he was the head chef at Noma, which if you know about Noma, that is in Copenhagen and has repeatedly won the #1 restaurant in the world. Wow. And then after 3 years working there, he made an interesting move. He headed back to the United States to take on the food challenge, a particular part of it that most of us don't spend enough time thinking about, which is school food. School food to me represents one of the most important issues because it's really how do we think about our future? How do we think about our children, their minds, what we feed their minds? How do we model that? So in 2016, Dan founded Brigaid. Brigaid is a very unique organization. It's a team of professional chefs, and these are folks who are very eager to apply their culinary experiences for school food service programs. And it's just an incredible organization to watch evolve. Today, Brigaid's work has expanded. It's in senior centers, state prison systems, and really guided still by Dan's belief that everybody deserves nourishing food, cooked with care, cooked with passion, and that is incredibly delicious. Dan, welcome to the podcast. What a treat to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it's just great to be talking to you. It's been a while.
Dan, let's start at a little beginning. You're a well-trained chef. Will you just tell us a little bit about how you got interested in food and what it's like, what it was like becoming a chef?
Yeah. So, I had the privilege of growing up in a large Italian family where food was very important. And there are a few folks in my family who were very good at cooking. And I think for me, it was the difference between, and I hate to say this because my mom is my favorite person on earth. She's not someone who really likes to cook. So when we were at home, she cooked all the time. I'm the third kid. I think by the time I came around, she was like, it was more of a chore than anything else. And when we would visit one of my aunts in particular, her food was just phenomenal. And still is. She's 83 years old and she's still cooking away. And I think it was the difference between food as something like, hey, we got to eat. You got to eat to live. And like, wow, like this food, this person is cooking for you to really make you happy and do everything they can to cater to you. And that's how I grew up. I got to eat a lot of really good food, and I got to eat at tables where, everyone at that table was like, oh man, this food is amazing. And I always equate it to like, I think everybody maybe not everyone, but when it comes to holiday time and it's like, you're going to maybe visit someone's home for a meal. There's like some folks, maybe you're not too excited about going to their house for that meal. And then there's other folks where you're like, yes. And for me, this was my one aunt. And honestly, she was like sole inspiration for the curiosity around cooking in general and cooking for people. And the idea that if you cook good food for people, they like you. And that's like a great feeling. And so that's how it started for me. That's how I got into it. And really at a young age, I started kind of asking her questions, 11, 12, 13 years old. I would dabble with her when we visited, cook a little bit. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was curious enough about what cooking was about and what it was like. And I kind of quickly became interested because I saw what she made look so easy. didn't see, realized it wasn't that easy. And then I took that as a challenge, and I went to a very competitive school, high school, where I think everybody freshman year of high school was like, this is what I want to do as my career. And I had no idea, or at least they knew where they wanted to go to college. And I had never even thought about it. I mean, I was still coming off of that, like maybe thinking I would be like a professional soccer player and realizing that that probably was not in the cards for me, because we all, have those aspirations at some point to be something that maybe is slightly unrealistic. And I said to myself, well, cooking, I really like cooking. And I went to like a career fair, and there was a woman there from the Culinary Institute of America. And she was like, you need to get a job, and you need to see if cooking in a professional sense is for you. I got a job working in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. when I was 15, and I loved it. I loved working in a restaurant. I loved cooking food for people. I loved the idea of being in a kitchen where I was kind of getting exposed to conversations that maybe a normal 15-year-old wouldn't get exposed to. And I thought that was cool. I would hear these kind of interesting conversations. And that's where it all started. And honestly, I never, from that point, never looked back and never considered another career. I was like, I like working in restaurants. I like cooking food. And I think by personality trait, I was like all in. I probably could have gone a different direction, but it didn't. That's where it ended up.
You're all in, and you end up at really one of the top culinary institutes, in the world, in America, right? And then you end up at a top restaurant, but you don't present as like a ultra competitive, striving to get to the top kind of. That's not your vibe exactly.
I'd say, I think internally it is a bit of my vibe. I like to excel. Um, I would like to think of myself as someone who's always looking to succeed and be the best I can. I don't think I would ever tell anyone that I am the best. I don't think I am. I was never the most talented. I was, like in anything I've done, I've never been the best, but I feel like have managed to maybe achieve beyond what I might seemingly think I'm capable of. So I've definitely strived for to be the best in some ways, but I think it's more of just I have this mentality of doing the best that I can and just putting everything I have into everything I do. So I think that has worked out well for me.
Yeah, maybe that's what I mean by the vibe that you have. It seems very like straightforward. It doesn't feel like you're striving in a certain way. Not that you don't have
Right.
ambition, but I think a lot of folks who are chefing at the top places in the world, there's a striving and an intensity that to you just feels kind of like you want to, I don't know, make amazing food for us, and as you said, have the kind of tables like you saw in your aunt's house. Um, are there things that we can learn from your aunt in terms of some of the questions you asked or ways that you saw her put ingredients together to make us better hosts?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing, and I don't think I really realized this as a young person, I only realized it after the fact, is that for me, it was always that we all loved going to her house because her food was excellent. But then I realized, like, I always ate everything as a kid. My whole life, I ate everything. My brother, I have an older brother and an older sister, and they were very picky eaters. And for her, she would cook this amazing food and then have to make something different for them. And do you think she skipped a beat to make something different for them? Not at all. Like for her, it wasn't like, oh, I know the food that I make is excellent. Why do I have to make something different? It didn't matter. Like these are her nieces and nephews who she loves so much. So I realized after the fact that as much as it was always like for me about why the food is excellent, it was just she made everyone feel very comfortable. Everyone feels comfortable there. It's like a second home, whether you've spent a lot of time there or not. So I think for me, it's like even though the food that she prepares is so delicious, it's more so if you go there and you don't like something or that she's not going to get upset. In fact, she's going to do everything she can to make sure she has something that accommodates you. And it doesn't make it seem like it's too much work. She doesn't make it seem like it's extra. So she's such a good host in the sense that she makes people feel so welcome and so comfortable that the food really in the end is kind of like an extra bonus. But I think sometimes I know I feel this way. Like when I cook for people as a chef, everyone gets a little bent out of shape of like, oh, like at least if they don't know me, if they don't know me and they're like, oh, he's a professional chef and he's cooking for me and like I got to eat it. I need to like it. I need to. and that's not comfortable. Like the best part about eating is being comfortable and enjoying it. So I think for me, until this day, still, everybody who goes there, I see my nieces and nephews now who are kids, and some eat well and some are picky. But whatever they need to eat, whatever they're happy eating, it's there, it's available to them, and they're comfortable asking for it, which I think is like the best thing you could do as a host is just make sure people feel comfortable to eat what they want to eat. And if they're not into it, maybe provide them something else.
What's your aunt's first name?
So her name's Rosemary. She goes by, so we call our aunts and uncles. So it's Zia as aunt and Zio's uncle. So she's Zia Rosa. So we refer to her as Zia Rosa.
Zia Rosa. It sounds like the top ingredient in Zia Rosa's cookbook is around making us feel comfortable. And I love that notion also, because so often when we're hosting, we encounter that, we get a little irritated or frustrated. It kind of what you're sharing, it's like this is the essence of hospitality, which is there
Yes.
is really no need of yours that's going to frustrate me because my job is to make you feel comfortable, nourished, cared for while you're here.
That's it. And what I will say now, it may be easier said than done, because I will say Zia Rosa is a bit of a beast when it comes to cooking, and she makes it look easy. Catering to other people's needs and things like that is more work and it's more to do. And she does it without breaking a sweat. So it is a little harder, but I do think that because I know when I've been tasked to cook Thanksgiving now that I'm no longer working in restaurants. So now my mother, who would never invite a group of people over, now that I'm in the mix, she will have many people around for Thanksgiving, and I cook that dinner.
That's a smart
I
move by
feel
your
like
mom. That's good strategy. I like
very
that's
smart
smart.
move.
Very smart.
Very intelligent woman. But when it comes to cooking, I feel like I've gotten much better in the past 5, 6 years. But I will say, when I was still working in restaurants, when I would kind of cook or anything, if someone's like, "Oh, I don't really want this," or it's like we're cooking beef for like a roast, and I'm like, "I'm going to cook this medium. That seems reasonable for everyone." And someone's like, "Well, I want this well done," and I don't know if I was as patient and as like I would do it and I'd be fine with it. It's not like these are my family, but I don't know if I did it with grace. I don't know if I did it with, oh yes, of course, like I'm going to get on that right away. And I think there's a very big difference there, but because people sense if they are asking you to do more. And I think that's the key with Zerosa is like, you don't feel like you're asking her to do more because she's ahead of it. She's ahead of everything. She's making sure that everybody has what they need without you even really needing to communicate it sometimes.
I'm having these competing anxieties. I want to hear about more about Zia Rosa's kitchen, but I'm worried. I'm worried, knowing how the metrics of these things work, that we're going to lose people before we talk about Brigade. Because I
Yes.
think when folks look to be generous, I think your organizations is one of the ones that everybody should pay attention to, because I believe you're on the ground, Dan. And I believe you're in there doing
Yep.
something that needs to be done so badly, which is we free schools from impractical ideas, which I think I want to hear your thoughts on school food right away, but also from this notion that we should feed our kids the cheapest, easiest, most processed food. That just I don't know. I just don't like that culturally for us as Americans. So I want you to head right to Brigade, but I want you to take us to the kitchen at Noma. 'Cause take us to Copenhagen. How old are you? What is it like living in Copenhagen? I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that kitchen, and then how you end up in school food in America.
Yeah. So I was basically in Copenhagen from, I think, age 28 to 30, 32, something like that. The restaurant, I mean, it's easy picture to paint because it's pretty distinct. So, pretty small restaurant, a 12 table restaurant. Uh, we were serving lunch and dinner, 12 tables, about 45 guests for lunch and 45 guests for dinner. The kitchen staff worked when the restaurant was open, the kitchen staff worked. So there was not two shifts. It wasn't like kitchen staff worked lunch and another shift worked dinner. Same staff. We were about 45 people in the kitchen, catering to about 45 guests at a time. About half of those people working in the kitchen worked voluntarily as interns. And we represented about 20 to 25 nationalities at any given point in time. So very unique kitchen setting in that sense.
Wow.
And then in terms of the guests, I mean, the expectation, as you mentioned, it was, the number one restaurant in the world. And as many people look at that, it's a little, you think it can be a little silly. It is a list that exists and it's sponsored by San Pellegrino Water. So it makes it even kind of stranger in a way. You're like, what's a water company? But people really follow that list. And there are people out there who fly around and they go and eat at these restaurants. And it was common for us on any given day to have multiple food critics from around the world, from different countries, multiple chefs, big time chefs from around the world, and multiple people who are these folks who would fly in for lunch from wherever and fly back out after lunch. And it was a tremendous amount of pressure every day, lunch and dinner. Like some restaurants, it's like, oh, we got a big night tonight because so and so is coming to eat, or tonight we're busy. That restaurant was fully booked lunch and dinner every single day. And every single lunch and dinner, we had people that were there to challenge this idea: is this the best restaurant in the world? So it's very, very high pressure environment, to say the least.
Well, and really only it's like you're only going to fall. It can't stay number one forever. And
Yes.
how do you guys deal with that pressure?
It was difficult. I mean, I know for me personally, I felt I'm an anxious person because I mean I suffer from anxiety, but I also I think generally and I don't think I realized that I was like anxious as a person until I left Noma, to be honest. When I was there, I was so consumed with the work itself, where I was nervous often, and I felt nervous pretty much night and day, constantly. A big part of my job as the head chef was, I don't want to say damage control, but it really was like people would stress out. People, I mean, people would cry because they were feeling so stressed out, or people would shut down because they were feeling so stressed out. And quite frankly, like oftentimes restaurants like that get a lot of negative press for the pressure that the restaurant puts on people, whether it's yelling or things like that. But quite frankly, for me, and I think for most people there, the pressure was really from the outside. It was constant, with social media. People would take a picture, say, well, I didn't know him. It wasn't the best restaurant. For me, it was like not very good. Like it was whatever it was. So it was constant pressure. And I remember during my time there, there was these awards for the number one restaurant in the world. Like it was a physical award. And after my first year there, we went to the awards and they were in London and we got number two. And again, I know this sounds so silly, but I just remember thinking to myself, like, are people even going to come to work tomorrow? Like, is that it? It's like people don't even want to work here anymore. It's the number two restaurant in the world. And then we ultimately got back to number one, but like it puts such strain on you as a person. I mean, physically, I can definitely afford to lose a few pounds right now, but I weigh like 250 pounds. I'm 6'5", 6'6". When I worked there, I weighed 160 pounds. I don't, it was very, very skinny. I saw a picture of myself the other day that my mom had, and I do not look healthy. I do not look healthy. That's for sure.
Can you tell us a little, as a chef, what was driving you and motivating you in your mind? In that, besides wanting to be, continue being a top place and respond to that challenge, is this the best place? Like, were you thinking about flavors and combinations? Like, how does that work in your head?
So it's funny because obviously the first thing we talked about was like why I got into cooking and Zeros and all this. This has nothing to do with that. Like, I basically, once I went to culinary school, it really became about kind of the competitive nature of like being the best, moving in that direction. And for me, Noma is a very unique restaurant in that, as I mentioned, there's that many people working in the kitchen. So there are a lot of positions there that maybe don't exist in a normal kitchen. Like in a normal kitchen, you have a chef, a head chef, and then that they're kind of doing a bit of everything. At Noma, there was myself as the head chef. We had an R&D team of chefs who really their whole focus. We had three chefs doing that. Their whole focus was to come up with new dishes. We had a fermentation lab where we had a chef. We also had a woman who recently got her master's degree in food science from MIT. She was a doctor. She was in that kitchen. So this was a restaurant with unique resources in that sense. So my job really there was to kind of keep it all together. And quite frankly, what drove me was the idea of it's like a sports team. It's kind of like we want to be the best we can. We want to win. And in our world, winning was every single person who came in the door would not say this was great or thanks, that was a great meal. I mean, I explicitly remember the notion of, one thing we would do in that restaurant, everybody who ate, we would give them a tour of the kitchen. It was like a whole thing. Like you came, you ate, and it was like you got a tour of the kitchen, you got to meet people. And Renee, who is the owner, chef owner of the restaurant, and still is, and probably the most influential chef of the last, 10, 15 years, he would always ask, he'd be like, well, how was it? That's what he would say. Like after I would give a tour, like if I gave maybe the famous chef who was eating that day a tour, he's like, how was it? And if my answer was not like exclamatory, he'd kind of be like, okay. Like if I was like, oh, they really liked it. And I knew that it would have to be, this was the best meal I've ever eaten, or my mind is blown. And if a guest didn't say that, it's like we didn't really do our job. And like you said, all you could do is kind of like there, and it's actually affected the way I manage now in a negative way, because there it was kind of like you either doing your job meant it was right, everything was right all the time, and that was it. Like there was no like, well, it could be a little better, or it's like it has to just be right. Like that's it. Like if it's right and it's perfect, great. We'll come back tomorrow and we'll do it again, and then the next day we'll do it again.
Yeah, it also doesn't seem that like one of those metrics, like you weigh 160 and your heart's racing all the time, is also like in the conversation. I think restaurants are one of these places that really like put a stark relief on how, um, or a restaurant specifically, how workplaces deal with or ignore mental health.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, 100%. And I think that is a big thing for me now, as not to skip even to what we do as Brigade, but as a company, really most of the people who work on our team, if not all of them, I mean, now we're approaching 60 people on the team, most of which are chefs, the majority of which all worked in restaurants previously. And it's a very different work life balance that we have. And I think you can see how it positively affects people.
Well, I'm curious about the transition. At some point, you make a choice that a lot of chefs never consider. I'm going to go from like number one restaurant in the world, number two, number one, number two, to like thinking about school food.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it really, I think that the first thing that came across my mind was moving on. And it's not because I didn't like working in restaurants. It's not because I was burnt out. In fact, I loved it. It's not because I didn't like Noma, because I thought it was, for me, it was a life changing experience. But at one point, it was time to move on. It was say, okay, I've done this. I've had this head chef role for 3 years, which takes a toll. That kind of role takes a toll on you. And it was like, it's time to do something else.
Wait, I just got to stop you because people struggle so much with this, Dan. Like, when do I know? How do I? Can you just tell us? Like, was it like some Monday you just knew? Like, how did you finally decide you're going to talk to Renee and say, Renee, it's been great?
Oh, that was very hard for me to do from
I'm
that
sure.
perspective, because also too, it took me a while to really feel as though I was doing working in the role in a way that was great and I felt really good about. I think for me, it took a little time. I mean, you have the feelings like, okay, I think you start, in my mind, I was like, I know I can't do this forever. And I think there was an element too. I was living in Copenhagen and I had a desire at some point to move back to the United States. But I think really what it was that I was surrounded by this restaurant, the best restaurant in the world. And I see this person in Renee who has become so influential. And for what it's worth, I played a significant role in that. But for me, I was like, you know what? Like, I want to go do something that, in this case, I was like, I want to do my own thing. I want to do my own thing. That was time for me to do my own thing. And that was really what I think pushed me to the place of like, it's time for me to go, because
Hmm.
leaving there is
It
very
also
difficult.
feels, often in the industry you're in, that's a very kind of. I'm wondering if there's a way that chefs like it in a way that like Renee knows you're coming in, but he also knows that you're going to take a lot of information and wisdom and then move on to something else. Is that true? Do chefs kind of like that? Like, oh,
I think it's probably the opposite, that they don't like that. I mean, I thought there are chefs who are very, very, they deal with people leaving very poorly. They come they take all this stuff and then they go work somewhere else and kind of almost like honestly a place like Noma is the best example. People go there, leave, and base their whole success off of having worked there. I honestly, in my time there, he dealt with that so well. And I think that's like such a compliment to him because there are a lot of chefs when people are like, I'm leaving, they're like, you know what, you're putting your month notice in, you can leave tonight, we don't even want you here anymore, like kind of like really treat it poorly because they're like, oh wow, you just came here like a sponge and you took everything and now you're taking it with you, instead of thinking it like you said, like wow, they're gonna like move on, they're gonna become successful in their own right, they've learned here, they're gonna take some of the things they learned here and maybe interpret it differently and spread the word, if you will. But it's usually the opposite in my experience, unfortunately. But at Noma, I really felt like I was amazed, honestly, because there were people there who, so many people were working there as interns who would spend a very brief amount of time there and really try to just get a bunch of stuff and then leave. And then literally they would open a restaurant in whatever country they came from. And it would say like, previously of Noma, so and so chef. And it's like they were there for like a week. It's like, what is that?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably part of what you're suggesting. Chefs don't like it because people come and take their wisdom and move on. I think there are also other chefs I see. I'm guessing you're like this. It sounds like Renee like this. Uh, I got to be friends with David Boulay, and after
Hmm.
he's passed,
Wow.
one of the things of getting to sort of sit with that is all of the people that he inspired and mentored. All of the chefs who were saying, who came through his kitchen in a way that have this kind of daddy transference to him. I think not that I was a chef that came through, but just there's a way his caring, his interest, his the kind of I don't know the magic of his green fun sauces. And so I think some of you all are just probably leading the field in a way where the beyond the competitiveness is you're in pursuit of something. Can I ask for? I don't mean to go back to like flavor. It's just I'm having a little hard time that. Well, I'm just having a little hard time that like because I see you enjoy stuff. I like watching your videos on the Instagram,
Sure.
whether it's candy or your sandwiches or your late night. I don't know. I feel like sometimes I feel like I've had a lot of late night snacks with you, and then I realize I never have. You just like fangirl Dan on Instagram. So, but but you pay a lot of attention to flavor, and I know that when you're cooking for the kids, it really matters to you. I remember in your TED talk, and folks, if you haven't seen, check out Dan's TEDx talk. You put up, I remember, so you put up two pictures, and you're like, and one of them was this like, all of us in the wellness world, oh, like the cabbage, we love this one, right? The colorful, all the plants, and you're like, which one would you serve the kids?
Right.
And you explained how the one that we thought looked a little bit more like school food was actually the one that worked and why.
Right.
That kids ate it, that you could execute it, that it tasted delicious. And so I'm having a hard time wrapping around that like Zia Rosa isn't like, co-piloting this with you in some way, or flavor isn't, or how, I guess more importantly, how you think about food and flavor as a chef.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would say is it's really going to be the most important thing, really, if you had to like name one thing. And I think that the most important thing beyond that is kind of who's like everybody has a different perception of flavor and what they like and don't like. And I think that's where the change was made in terms of my mind coming from a place like a Noma to doing what I do now, or how Ziarosa cooked for people, is this idea of when you, and I say this often, but I've said this for a while, but I think it still makes a lot of sense to me, is when you're cooking in a place like Noma, it's about the flavors that you want to present to people. That's what's important. People are coming from all over the world to taste something maybe they've never tasted before, or experience something they've never experienced before, or maybe more generically, they're there to taste the flavors that you want to put out there, that you want to put together. Whereas in the setting that I work now with Brigade and feeding kids in schools, it doesn't matter what I think tastes good. It just doesn't. It really doesn't matter at all. All that matters is what tastes good to the kids. And obviously, that's a generic statement because there's a lot of kids with a lot of different palates and things like that. And that's where a lot of challenges lie. But that's a hard thing. That's a hard transition to make when you're used to thinking about things a certain way as a chef. And now it's like, well, to me, I think this needs a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But and then I have to ask, like, we deal with this with some of the chefs that we have on our team now. They're like, well, I want to add this. I'm like, well, why do you want to add that? they're like, well, I think it will really add this flavor to it. I'm like, do we think that the kids are going to appreciate that or enjoy that? Or do you want to add it because that's just the inclination for you as a chef with your background? So, and that's not also to downplay that kids, that we shouldn't be introducing kids to new foods and all these, because of course we can. Because sometimes I have folks tell me that, like, well, shouldn't we be introducing kids? Of course we should.
Kind of. I mean, it's a question. It's a question actually, probably around the purpose of school food. And so, if palate development is one of our agendas, and and also we're going to allow a lot of kids to throw it away, because I want that option, right? In the sense of, you're going to give me something new I don't like, I don't want to be forced to eat it. But uh, I'm wondering, going from, I think you guys like served live ants at Noma that were
Yeah,
like
right.
different
Yeah, we did.
flavors and like different nests taste different ways, right? Where you're really seeking the edge of culinary experience and flavor, right? The ants also probably tasted good somehow. What did you learn in that transition, and help us understand more about how kids' palates work?
Yeah, I mean, in that transition, and I should be very honest that, like, when I was at Noma, the kitchen was open at Noma, and so it was only 12 tables. You could see the tables, and I would watch people eat. These are adults. These are adults that waited months to eat at this restaurant. And I always remember, like, we would serve a lot of dishes, and the dishes were very small. So it was like 2, 3 bites per dish. And I remember, like, 6 dishes would come back from a table of 6 adults, and they would be half eaten. And I'd ask the waiter, like, okay, what happened there? We need to make sure, like, we're figuring that out, because clearly they didn't. No, no, they loved it. They said they loved it. I'm like, well, they didn't love it because it's 3 bites and they didn't finish it. So, like, we've got an issue. But what would happen is, so these are adults, and they would just be like, nobody would say they didn't like it, because it was almost like they didn't get it. Like, if somebody said they didn't like the meal, it's like they didn't understand the concept, which I hate that. I hate that idea, because if you don't like eating something, you should say it. I didn't enjoy this meal. Kids will say it. Kids will say what they don't like. So I think that's one of the biggest differences, because I think a lot of adults probably eat things in restaurants or in places that maybe they're not super into and they don't like that much, but maybe they don't say it the same way. And kids, for better or for worse, sometimes when they're honest, it really hurts, and they use like pretty sharp language, and it's like, whoa, but at least you know where you're at. And I think, don't get me wrong, are there differences in palates between a 6-year-old child and an adult? Yeah, sure. But I think sometimes we kind of make it seem like it's a much bigger difference than it is. I honestly think that it's more about, once you can get a kid to try it, and if you can get a kid to try something without the noise around it, peer pressure. I mean, peer pressure in schools is, I mean, obviously we just talked about peer pressure as adults at Noma, but peer pressure in a cafeteria, one kid says, I thought this, like, whether it's a high school kid who's like, this is gross, and uses choice language, and kids are like, yeah, I'm not eating this. Or it's a young kid who's just like, and like no one wants to eat something. But if you can get a kid to try something without that noise, I think you realize that, like, palates aren't that much different, but it's hard to get that noise out of the mix. And it's hard to get kids to try things that maybe they're not familiar with. But if you can do it, I think when they actually eat it, I think there's not as big of a difference as we think there is, in my opinion, in our experience.
It sounds like one of the differences is you feel the kids are straight with you, and if it's so good, they
Oh,
say yuck. And
yes. Yeah, they don't. I mean, they don't care, and I love that, and that's important, and that's also that's so useful to make food that kids like, because they're direct in terms of their communication.
I want to hear how Brigade goes into a school. And when I was feeling kind of like a coward, maybe, or not active enough. I was like, huh. It's like, why haven't I been talking with Dan about coming to Jackson and getting involved with school food here? And this community is really cares about all of this stuff.
Yeah,
And like I said, I think we kind of don't consider it, or we let it happen, or I don't want to maybe rock the boat in my community. So how do schools get involved with you, and what happens?
sure. Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned, like, rocking the boat and this type of thing, because we really do. And when I say this, people think it sounds kind of pretentious, like we're some exclusive service, but we don't reach out to anybody. We don't. What you see on Instagram is the only marketing we do, and it's not. Sometimes it's not really meant to be marketing, and the marketing really, if anything, is geared more towards chefs to join our team, because that's really what we look for. But in terms of school districts, we wait for school districts to come to us. We have a lot of parents writing to us. We get a lot of emails from parents, and we actually say it on our website now. Like, if you're a parent, we're not going to just talk to you about coming into your school district, because that kind of puts that person who's in charge of the food service program, the food service director, in a bad place. Like, we want to make sure the food service director, the person in charge of that food service program, wants to talk to us. They are interested in speaking to us. We sometimes get folks who are, the superintendent of a school district, or sometimes even politicians, local politicians, who are like, we want you to come to our district. Our first question is always, is the food service director in the conversation? Are they in the know on this? Because if they're not, that's obviously going to make them feel pretty lousy. So usually the way it happens is the food service director contacts us. They say they're interested in talking to us. We figure that out. And then our first step is, once we start to work together, we look at every school they have. So whether it's 100 schools, whether it's 5 schools, we go to every single school they have. We take account of all the equipment, the infrastructure, condition, what systems are in place, what systems aren't in place. Our goal is to know as much about, if not more, about their food service program than they know. So this way we can be helpful. And then from there, we create a plan. And then we place chefs, either one chef, depending on the size of the district, or multiple chefs. And our whole model is predicated on those people from our team working with the people who are already working in the school kitchens. We're not displacing people. We are working with those folks to help those school districts reach their goals. Another important point, we don't go into districts to tell them what food they should serve and what food they shouldn't serve. There are a lot of organizations that are pretty explicit in terms of the values of the food they want to see served in the places they work. We're not that way. We say, this is your community, this is your program. What food do you want to serve to your kids? We're going to help you get there through the lens of our chefs on our team.
How do you collect that information? You sit down with the community and the food service director and kind of do you do a survey? How do you understand? I feel like uh, and I guess I have some strong opinions of what I would want my kids to eat for lunch, but I don't think I've ever been asked.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, and I will say this to parents directly. I speak at board meetings sometimes. I think that's the difficult thing of being in the position of a food service director of a school district, because there are a million different opinions. Parents have opinions what they want their kids to eat. And obviously, every parent is very much thinking about their own children, which I completely understand. Although there are, hundreds, if not thousands, of children in that school, in that particular school or school district. The superintendent, the leadership of the school district has opinions, the school board has opinions, and then the students have opinions, obviously. And for what it's worth, and I'm not going to discredit parents here, because obviously making sure parents feel good about what their kids are eating is important. But at the end of the day, the most important opinion, far, far beyond every other opinion, is the kids' opinions. What do they want to eat? And getting their feedback in a way that's constructive can be challenging. You have a lot of kids, if you say, what do you want to eat for lunch? They're like, Taco Bell. Like, okay, well, we're not Taco Bell, so we can't give you Taco Bell. But so it's a process. It takes time, but it's important to figure out in a constructive way. And we have found it the best way to do it is in surveys. Can be like a landmine. I mean, you give surveys out, especially to high school kids. I mean, they will write things on those surveys that, we can't say, we're not going to say here, and it makes you feel terrible about yourself. But sitting down with a group of 4 or 5 high school kids and kind of chatting with them, and obviously it would help if you already have some kind of a relationship with them. You can get to a place where you get some constructive feedback of like, yeah, we don't like this because, and it's like, well, that's pretty reasonable, but this is something that we would actually like to see on the menu. And then obviously the most important thing is, if you are going to solicit this feedback, that you are in a position to actually act on it. And I think that's where we come in terms of being able to prepare people to actually act on that feedback. I know this, and I'm sure a lot of folks know it, that a lot of school districts are not in a situation in terms of how they're organized, or the equipment they have in their kitchens, the space they have in their kitchens, to prepare meals from scratch. Like, if all the money in the world came to them tomorrow, that doesn't mean they're in a position to start doing that. In implementing those systems and putting them in place can take time. It could take a year. It could take 2 years before they're even in a place to say, hey, we're going to start making food ourselves, versus, buying pre-purchased meals or whatever it may be. So it's a process, and it's hard. It's challenging.
Yeah, and I also think that part of, if you're in a big school district, you're serving 1,000 plus lunches a day. Let's say you've got to be doing that as you're thinking about changing and innovating. Where I think an organization
Well,
like
that's a great point, Drew. I mean, it is one of those things that most of these districts, because of the resources, the lack of resources, you're focused on just getting it done today, like tomorrow, the next day, versus like creating long-term plans and working on kind of things beyond the day to day can be really, really challenging. And I think again, that's kind of where I feel we come in. We're kind of like a jetpack. It's like we have these goals, and if we don't have someone to get us over the hump, we might never get there. So we come on board and we can kind of help them do that.
it's really fascinating that you're not focused on which foods, right? So many places want cafeterias to go like vegan or vegetarian or to serve grass-fed beef, right? They're focused on the foods. Your interest, it sounds like, is more scratch cooking and more kind of, I would say, flavor, like less processed foods. Are those kind of the explicit goals of Brigades, and are there some other ones in there?
I would say when talking about food, um, our goal is to serve whoever we're serving the best food possible. And I think that can be a variety of things. When I first started the company, we were pretty like everything's got to be scratch cooked, this and the other thing. Now there are a lot of school districts that are not in a place to scratch cook. There in any way. There are some districts that can do some scratch cooking, but not everything. So having that mentality is not super helpful to say like, well, it's either everything scratch cooked or not. But what I would say is what we do see often, and again, back to this idea, is that you should always be searching for the best thing you can do within the parameters that you're working within, which are a tight budget, nutritional guidelines, limited equipment, and so on.
Give us the
That doesn't
details
mean
of
that.
that. Most of us don't know. Give us the details of that budget. No, I just think most people have no idea the
Yeah,
numbers
sure.
involved here. It's literally blows the mind.
Right. So right now, our target for the cost of ingredients for let's say a high school student is around $1.50. That's really kind of where we're at. And within that lunch, we need to offer 5 components. It's a protein, a whole grain, a fruit, a vegetable, and a milk. Kids have to take 3 of those items at least, but can take all 5. And just to put into perspective, so if a student takes a milk, let's say right now is about a quarter, 25 cents, 30 cents for a carton of milk. So out of that $1.50, now 30 cents is gone. You have $1.20, let's say, to put a meal together that fits pretty, I mean, I don't want to say strict nutritional guidelines, but nutritional guidelines that put parameters on what you're doing. So you can't just cook food. You have to cook food per a very specific recipe that's been developed. And you're oftentimes cooking that food or preparing that food in a kitchen that is pretty limited. Not all school kitchens are limited, but the challenge I think lies is if you have 10 schools, 4 of them might have full-blown kitchens because they're from 1970, 1960, and then you have another few kitchens that were built 20 years later that have no kitchens. That's where it becomes difficult. You have that's what it is.
When did that switch happen? That schools stopped having kitchens and a cook and a chef and all that to like the food got shipped in, and how was that assessed that it was either going to work or not going to work?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, we see it especially when you go to the big school districts like New York City public schools. You can see the generational shifts and like this was our idea of how we're going to do food service from like. I mean, I think once the idea of convenience foods like kind of TV dinners and things like that came into normal culture, that became a concept that made sense in school districts as well. But I think aside from what like food trends are in the world, like right now, I'd argue that food is of utmost importance in the United States in terms of how do we make more foods from scratch? How do we do this? But still, we'll see schools being built, and there's really no consideration for that at all. And that's just how things work. It's weird. It's like there's no long term plan on, hey, this is the food service. And I think that has to do with turnover of administration in schools, leadership, things like that, where things just fall through the cracks. So new schools are being built every day, some of which I mean, we go to school kitchens that are incredible. Like we're in a school district that is a low income school district, and one of their new schools has a walk station in it. Like, because their leadership team was like, we are putting prominence on food and we want to make sure we're positioning our students to eat really well.
Tell us about what the success looks like, because obviously lots has gone wrong in school food.
Yeah, I mean, the success is so simple because really, as far as I'm concerned, the success, if we want to look at success of school food, it just looks like what you would expect if you went down the street to any food service operation and paid for food. But unfortunately, we've come to accept that in a school food environment, or for that matter, an institutional environment, should look anything different. Like even the term school food, it's like making an excuse for food
Right.
that's served in a school.
Don't mind
It's
that.
like saying,
It's school food. It's like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
oh, okay, fair enough. Like and we've heard, I mean, I hear parents, so I hear people saying like, school food, it's like just part of like life, like you grow up and you don't eat well, and that's like, I hear that from parents of students in the districts where we are working in, because they're like, what's the point of this? Like, do we really need this? Like having a chef in a school. I don't know if I've told you this before, but when we first started in New London, Connecticut, and we're still there, and it's the best example of our program. Most of the food is cooked from scratch. The kids love the food. And when we first got signed on by the Board of Education, it was in the newspaper, like the online newspaper. And in that online newspaper, there's a comment that said, might as well just send our kids to school in limousines. Because it was this idea of like having a chef in a public school is ridiculous. Like, why would we do that? It makes no sense. So, for me, the success is literally just like, even if you went to like, your normal fast casual restaurant where the food was hot, it was tasty, it came to you relatively quickly. The space was clean and organized. Like it's not much. And it's just like, that's what kids deserve. They just, when they go to school, they deserve a meal that's thoughtfully prepared, wholesome, nice, tasty. There's some options catering to kids, different types of tastes, kids, different kind of aversions. And that's really it.
The psychiatrist in me is going to have to disagree that you left Zia Rosa behind. Both that I don't think that's probably possible, but two, there's something you're talking about. I haven't really thought about school food this way, or the school eating experience, about what it feels like when we know a system cares about us.
Mm, yes.
Just how much loyalty that engenders in us.
It's so
How
important.
how much we want to be there. The difference between the restaurant and the school food. Right, we want to go to that restaurant usually, right? We pick it, we choose it, we get to decide what we want to eat. And so you're being in the schools, talking to a few students, maybe those students letting other students know, hey, I talked to Chef Dan and the Brigade team, and we're going to try. They want to try this, or we said Taco Bell, and they said, well, what about taco night or taco lunch, right? Where you're asking them to put their imprint on it, that the institution is something that institutions aren't things that oppress us, control us, etc. They're things that we build and that we can have a lot of control over. And it's a very, I think, inspiring idea to give kids about their food.
I mean, we've had. I remember in New London when we first started. I remember a high school student saying, like, "I don't even like the food you're serving here today, but we can, like I can see that there's a lot of work going into it, and we appreciate that." I thought that was like the best example because like this kid didn't even like the food, didn't even like it, but was like, "Wow, like thank you," because clearly a lot of work is going into this, and I think that was more important to that particular student. Just the idea that there was a group of people working very hard and trying to do their best to make food for the students of that school.
Yeah, I also think chefs are cool. I mean, well, it's kind of, you've pointed out something about chef culture, and I really love your messaging that if you really care about food and cooking delicious food and creating something for other people, then more of us should be in school cafeterias. And so I just think it's wonderful. But there's also in the milieu of the last 20 years of all of the cooking shows, all of the chef celebrity. And so I also think there's got to be something where the kids, get exposed to that, where for a lot of us who didn't maybe grow up in a food culture or
Right.
with family members who worked in restaurants or were chefs, it's just, I think it's just also a great thing of demonstrating that everywhere you go, there are restaurants, there's jobs there, there's expertise, and around the world, people care about food, and it's just a wonderful place to explore and to learn and to think about occupationally. Dan, I want to switch the subject. I see our time is running short here, and I want to
Sure.
switch the subject just a little bit
Yeah.
to male mental health.
Yes.
And I guess a couple things. One, I really appreciate you mentioning that you had anxiety earlier and just being open with that. And I'm curious your take on male mental health today, and like especially how it shifted. You just turned 40. I just turned 50. So I like this, to have it over the last maybe 10 or 15 years. Well, what do you see is going on with male mental health?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak from my specific experiences. I think when I was at Noma, I was like, I never thought about, I don't think, I mean, this is probably, I don't need to tell you, but it seems like maybe it wasn't much of a conversation not too long ago when it came to just mental health in general. And I think when I was at Noma, I felt I was always like, I was nervous and kind of anxious all the time. Um, but I was so engaged that like, I don't know, like you just kind of like time goes and like you're just always busy and it was fine. And then when I came back from Noma and I knew I was going to start this business, but I was, like trying to figure it out. So I'd have days where like, I wrote a few emails and this, and I was definitely not working 18 hours a day running around like I was at Noma. And it was one day I was driving from Washington, D.C. to New London, Connecticut. I was like, I knew I was going to start this transition. We were going to start the company in New London. And I just remember this like it was yesterday. I went to a gas station and it was a late night drive. So I got myself like I think it was a Red Bull or Monster drink, whatever. And the guy's like, it's just like this moment kind of changed my life. And that's why I say it in such detail. He's like, it's two for $5. You want a second one? I'm like, yeah, sure. So I ended up drinking both of these, which is something I would never like normally do. And like for what it's worth, when I was at Noma, I was drinking like 15 espressos a day. I mean, you're just drinking coffee, all it's caffeine, caffeine, caffeine. But I drank these two energy drinks, got to my hotel, the Holiday Inn in New London, Connecticut, and I'm like sitting there and I'm like, man, my like chest hurts, and then like my arm hurts. And like this goes on for like an hour. And then I'm like, maybe something's wrong. And as soon as in my mind, I was like, something's wrong, I freaked out. And of course, at the time, I didn't know what was going on. And I was like, I got to go to the hospital. I'm having a heart attack. I'm going to die. Get to the hospital, like freaking out at the hospital. They're doing what they need to do to make sure like I'm fine. But I had a panic attack. Like never experienced anything like that in my whole entire life. And actually, strangely enough, have never had a panic attack since then. And that was in 2016, but it changed so much for me. I was like, I had a panic attack. And for a couple weeks, I really like it struggled. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to like be around a lot of people. I didn't really, and then slowly but surely, if I had that feeling coming on, I realized like that's what it was. Like I'm having a panic attack. I know what it is. So I never had one again. But really, since then, and it opened my eyes to like, I'm an anxious person. I know I suffer from anxiety. I know I have that. And I think for me, I kind of just, I don't know, like I had a panic attack and I told everybody I had a panic attack. And I don't know why, but I didn't feel ashamed of it. And then I also am very upfront about telling people I have anxiety and like that doesn't bother me. And I think for me, that's actually been a coping mechanism. Like, I'm okay with it.
How do you get okay, like, just sharing it with people? So many folks are so, like, we kinda, I don't know, think about it as a weakness or the stigma.
Yeah, I think for me, it was one of these things that maybe part of it's a confidence thing, but I also feel like it's like anxiety. Like, I mean, just knowing people, if, I think I get a pretty good read on people when I talk to them. And I'm like, there's no question a lot of people I meet, I'm pretty sure without knowing that they probably also suffer from anxiety, and it's like, and I feel maybe as someone who tries my best to connect with people as well. And, I don't ever like to put myself out there in a way that maybe I feel unapproachable. and maybe that wasn't always the case, definitely. And I think now, especially with the work I do now, I go into a lot of places where I don't know people, and I'm trying my best to like, hey, I'm Dan, and I want them to feel comfortable. It's just like sharing those things and being open about it and not making it a secret. Um, I, I don't think of it as like in any way. Like if someone's going to tell, like the stigma for me, it doesn't exist. Like for me, it doesn't exist. I guess because I think I recognize it in a lot of other people. I think that's probably what it is. I don't know if I think about it enough to give a good answer here, but I do think when I meet people, I'm like, well, this person clearly feels like they probably also have a little bit of anxiety, and I can see it. And that's fine. I can share that I'm anxious, and maybe that will make them feel a little better.
Yeah, well, you do the super cool pivot with it where you see it as something that actually connects you up with people and gives you more empathy.
I think so. I mean, I like, for me, I feel very fortunate. Things have gone well for me in a lot of ways. Like I've worked hard, and I feel good. Like, so if I think when I'm around other people, I do my best, like my part, if you will, to like, hopefully when they're around me, they feel good too. And I think part of making people feel good and comfortable around you is connecting with them. And if they do have things that maybe they're not confident about, if you can, like for example, like the idea of like, you might not know someone's not like, if they're anxious, they suffer from anxiety or not, they're probably suffering from something. They probably have something they don't feel good about, that they don't feel good sharing. So if I share something that for them they might feel as though, wow, that's pretty crazy that he shared that, that makes me feel better about this thing that I don't feel too proud about, I think it's good. If you can do that, I think it's a good thing. And I think the more of that, I think we'd all be in a little better place if everybody, was like a little, could be. And I don't expect people to. It's not like a trade either. It's not like if I share that about myself, that my expectation is that they're then going to share something about. No, it's just more of like the assumption is like for sure, because we all have things that aren't going great, and or things that we're not, we don't feel great about or don't feel confident about or whatever it may be. So I just like to make people feel comfortable in that way.
Appreciate that. I'm sure your team appreciates that. I also think everybody listening, it's something for us all to consider. It certainly helps me when I think about whatever I'm struggling with, that I, I'm not alone in it. And in some ways that it really connects you up with other people who are certainly struggling with a very similar set of issues, whether it's being middle-aged guys, because you're not quite there yet, almost.
I do it with my hair too. I post some. You've seen it. I post like there's a lot of guys who are very self conscious that they don't have hair, and like for me, I don't know. I don't care. Like I'm like I lost my hair. Like I don't have any hair. It's fine. It is what it is. Not something to worry about. And like it kills me to think there are guys who really like something is, in my opinion, is so superficial, and like it doesn't matter like that would be a barrier to them feeling good about themselves, not having hair.
I wonder if that's because you've gotten stuff together more on the inside. And whether like this wonderful family unit you describe, or having this kind of storied kitchen family at Noma for a few years. But I wonder if part of the reason you really you see it for what it is. As you said, it's a superficial thing. It has very little to do with how intriguing, attractive, wonderful, etc. you are as a person. But a lot of people have a hard time with that.
Yeah, and I guess for me, like I at the same time, I don't want to like discredit the idea of people not feeling good about that, but I also just it makes me sad to think that like you'd be a person that just because you're losing your hair, it makes you not feel good about yourself. It's kind of like it is what it is, and I think that I guess I'm a firm believer too that we all have things that we have to offer. You know, for me, I don't have a great head of hair to offer, but I've got some other things that I can offer. And I think everybody's got something to offer. And I think that's also, you know, it's like a mutual respect too. Like I have respect for people because as much as like I might not see it in front of me what they're good at or like what they can bring to the table, I know that everybody's got something. Everybody's, like I can meet this person on the street, and for me, yeah, sure, I've become a successful chef and this and that, but like this person is probably better at a lot of things than I am. And it's just that recognition. Like everybody around us can do things better than we can, and vice versa. And I think it's just that mutual respect, you know.
Yeah, it's got real humility in that of recognizing the differential abilities in different folks. I like that coming from really rural America and having spent a lot of time in New York, just kind of, having a foot in both of those worlds and just seeing the different gifts that people possess, whether it's
It's crazy. It's
somewhere back,
amazing.
somewhere back home who just understands like the woods and being
Right.
in the
Exactly.
woods
That's
in
what
a
I'm
way that's
talking
just like,
about.
it's just like incredible to be with those people. They know so much about the trees and the plants. I got a good buddy Ian, like that's just so fun. Whereas, the folks in New York who, know something else that's just phenomenally interesting. So it's a great lesson for us. It reminds me we were back in Indiana, and I had this. I got really influenced somehow by this kind of country, kind of Christian country idea that if you're feeling upset, or, mad at the person in front of you, you just got to imagine the person driving that slow truck is Jesus. And I'm not from a very Christian background, but it always, and I was standing in line then, earlier, and there's people in front of just irritate me. And I was
Right.
like, and I just sort of had that idea, what if, you'd have a really different response. And I don't know why it pops into my mind, but I guess that noting the inherent value of all of us and how it settles us down. It makes us less competitive. It makes us less self-conscious, and most importantly, it makes us more connected to those around us, and feeling like if we're anxious, we're in cahoots with a lot of other people who are anxious, and if we really need to, would understand that about us.
Right. And I've actually, and I don't know what this comes from, but I've had people like my sister or people in my family tell me that when they're around me, they feel it like I'm a calming presence, which when I first heard that was kind of like it made me kind of laugh because I know, like I said, I can be very anxious at times, but that's also a great indication to me. It's like, wow, okay, if I can be a calming presence for that person, it really makes you kind of self-reflect. Like, well, sometimes I don't feel super calm, but I can provide that maybe to somebody else. And I don't know, it's like a big cycle where you just start to realize that, maybe your perception of yourself is not completely accurate in a lot of ways. And I think if you have a few people say to you like, hey, you have a calming presence, you start to believe that. And you're like, wow, okay, like when I'm around, I can make people feel calm and comfortable, which is great.
I think also you're describing how a mental state or kind of a way that we feel we're set on the inside a little bit nervous, a little bit down, a little bit loose, whatever it is, uh, that's not necessarily how everyone else is viewing us. Often it isn't, and that also doesn't represent the role that we need to play. Right? Just because you're feeling anxious sometimes doesn't mean you need to always be anxious. And I like that idea. I wonder if in part because I've been in a lot of settings where your anxiety needs to be something that drives you but doesn't derail you. Right?
Yeah.
That kind of settling it, calming it, or I'd say harnessing it, is how I describe it to patients, is something that people around you pick up on. Like kind of the calm vibe is around your ability to use the anxiety as fuel, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely been, I would contribute some of the things I've been able to accomplish, to being an anxious person and how that has kind of made me be meticulous in certain ways and things like that. So I think also, too, I think it's looking at anxiety and trying to make it something that maybe is not debilitating for you, but something that you can harness in a way. And I guess that's another thing for me. Like I don't see anxiety as something maybe that's, I don't know. First of all, like I said, I feel like it's very common, but I also see it as something that is very much part of who I am, and again, part of a lot of the things I've been able to do as a person.
Yeah, and I think that meticulous nature, or that like anxiety is caring about outcome, caring and worrying about the future, right? And wanting at the heart of it is wanting things to go a certain way, be good, um, be approved of. And so some of that is really, I've written in the past about parts of anxiety really like a superpower. If it overwhelms you and leads to panic, and prevents you from kind of executing or thinking clearly. But if it's got you worried, it doesn't taste quite right. I'm gonna be worried until I get this like, or this doesn't have
Right.
the crunch it needs, or like this
Right.
didn't, so that's really great anxiety that allows us to in some ways demonstrate that we care, we're paying attention, that our efforts matter. I think there's a way that when we lose that, it's very hard. It's very hard to navigate life. Uh, Dan, I could just keep talking with you. I have so many more questions about one about how to make my cooking delicious like yours, but also ways that we can integrate more nutritional psychiatry and more thinking about mental health into
Yep.
school food. There's so
Yep.
much possibility here, but mostly I wanted our community to know about you. I mentioned you in a lot of talks, and when people are asking me, what to do, I just think school food is such a potent place. Just I remember for National Kale Day way back when I had problems with kale. Um, California, the LA County school system was in California is introducing like 5 superfoods into the menus, and so they wanted kale to be one of them. And so in one day in LA County, they harvested like it's like 11,000 pounds of kale or something, and they served kale in like every public school in LA. And I just remember it just demonstrated the power of. I wish I remembered her name, but the school, the food service director, just it was because of her. She reached out to us, said, "Hey, can we? We're thinking about this. What do you think?" And it was just a wonderful demonstration of how much power school food systems can have. I remember there's another place in Vermont that I visited in Burlington, where University of Vermont had contracted with it was a man who owned an orchard to buy his apples, buy all the local apples, and it just gave him a consistency in income that really allowed his farm to have more security. Put local apples there at University of Vermont, which was lovely. And so there's all these wonderful synergies. If you are in your community wondering how to improve health, mental health, and get involved with the cause, that's great. Sounds like Dan's recommendation is make sure and not bypass the food service directors of our country who are already figuring out how to feed all of our kids for $1.50, which is pretty impossible. But that there is a lot of good that can be done. Dan, tell everybody a little bit about your organization, how to get involved, how to donate, how to help your cause.
Yep. So again, the company's called Brigade. We are spreading across the United States, and if we're not in your state yet, we will come there. There's no limitation on that. We have a website. It's called chefsbrigade.com. We're on Instagram, both at Brigade and then at my name, Dan.Giusti. My account is primarily school food related, some other fun bits in there. But you can go to our website. You can email us. If you're curious about school food, you want to learn more, let us know. I'm always into trying to take time to get people to understand more about the space. The more people who get it, the more people understand it, the more people we can support in the process, and kind of move things forward. So, and I think if you know anyone who works in school food, just give them a thank you, give them a pat on the back. They have a very hard job, and as Drew said, they're very influential people and very important people. Those folks working in school cafeterias every day.
Dan, thanks so much. It's just a treat to be following your path and the way that you've really made a bold choice, an exciting choice to go from serving very, very interesting, exotic, high-end food to just a few VIPs every night to really trying on a soon to be national level to really shape how we think about nourishing our kids, how we think about supporting chefs and giving them more opportunities for great stable jobs during the day, and
Right.
to inspire our kids, that we care about them and we care about what they eat. We
That's
care
right.
about their palate and we care about them, as you said, getting the best, freshest, realest food they can. It's not exactly how you put
That's
it,
right.
but getting the best food. It's just an inspiring message. Everybody, thank you so much for spending some more time with us and for checking out the podcast. I really hope this inspires you and gives you some hope. One of the reasons I love Dan is just he gives me a lot of hope that there are great players in the space who are really dedicated to making big changes. Please share this episode with anybody who's caring about mental health and school food. And most importantly, I hope you take some inspiring messages from Dan about his transitions, about how he's trusting some of his intuition and moving his life along. And it's just really inspiring to speak with you and to hear about your journey. And I look forward to our next combo, man. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you, Drew. Thank you so much.